About AngularJS service types and use cases. We've really only used factories, at least in the course of our workshop, so I wanted to kind of explore that a little more. What is a service? A service is an object in Angular whose API is defined by the individual developer who's creating the service, rather than the Angular devs who, created controllers or directives, things like that. And those are special objects that the Angular devs defined. Services are what we get to make. There are 5 types of services. They're providers, factories, services, values, and constants. Despite the fact that services is a type of service, they're all actually based on the provider. Everything else is syntactic sugar on top of it. They're all singletons that basically provide objects that are injectable by some of the other services or by a controller, things like that. So the simplest is kind of the value, which is just basically a single value that's provided to the app. You can inject it into controllers or the other services that take injectables, but you cannot put it into config, which I'll go over in a little second here. So it's very simple syntax. You just assign it, the name that you're going to inject when you're using it, and then the actual value. And then a constant is provided kind of in the same way. It uses the same syntax as the value, but you use the keyword constant. It can be injected into configuration. So if there is something you need to use when you're booting up the app, you can do that. And it can't be changed by a decorator, and you should basically never change a constant. So you want it to be something that never changes, like the number of planets. So you can basically provide something across the entire module, which is really useful. Keeps you from doing things like putting stuff on root scope, injecting a factory just to use one variable, or defining a global variable, all of which I have done in Angular. And if you want to use it to set up the app again in config, use a constant. So then we go on to factories and services. Factory, you can actually use it exactly like a value. You can just return a string if that's what you want to do, but typically you'll be returning an object with multiple elements related that you want to use. So you set them on the object that the factory returns, and then you can use them where you inject the factory. A service, on the other hand, actually you set everything on this, and basically a new factory is instantiated using that object. So it ends up being functionally identical. The only difference is really how you end up defining it. And the Angular style guide actually recommends using factories for consistency's sake. But I guess as long as you're consistent, try and keep things from being confusing. That's the really important thing. And the final type is the provider. Again, everything is based on it, so it's the most kind of specific and most fully featured. It implements a $get method, and that's actually whatever the get method returns is what provides properties to controllers, for example. So in the case of a factory, it ends up returning that factory object or the newly instantiated factory object if you're just using a service. And then you also set properties on the provider using the this keyword, and those can actually be accessed and changed when the provider is injected into configuration. So for example, up here, you can see you're setting the interlocutor name on the human emulation provider in the configuration. So that will actually be able to change it in the provider where the this.interlocutor name is defined. The function reassure self, which is up there, won't be accessible when you're injecting the human emulation provider. And then everything in the $get there are the things that you will have access to upon injecting it into controller. So in the controller then, you can see where you can set the name based on the human emulation provider's .person, which gets set basically from interlocutor name, which gets set in configuration, and then call the functions using that. So depending on the name you set in config, you can end up actually changing throughout the app what the functions return for the greetings. So use cases for the provider, anything where you want modularity basically, where you're actually going to be configuring something, so a component that you want to use in multiple apps, or that you want to provide in a node module maybe, for other people to use. Maybe they don't want to use it to a factory or something to the specifications that you put in. So they can then modify it when they initialize the application. But if you're not going to provide that ability to configure it, then you can probably just use a factory or service instead to the same effect. So to recap, you have values and constants that just provide a simple value to the application. Constants can be used in the configuration if you want to base something on them. Factories and services usually have consistent grouped together related functionality that they're providing, like auth service and FSG, which is all about authorization. And then you have providers, which you can use for modular components, which you can expose things that the end user can modify. And there we have my resources. The Angular docs are great on this, hugely helpful, and have tons of code examples. And then the Angular style guide also, which is unique and being recommended by Angular and completely kind of disses services. Thanks.